as well. I am delighted to introduce to you my wonderful colleague, Professor James Holt, who is coming to talk to us today about his new book as part of Interfaith Week. It's really exciting to have to listen to James. He's always an inspiring speaker, and I hope that this talk and Q&A is going to be really informative for us all. If you've got any questions, we're going to have roughly about a 40-minute talk and then 20 minutes at the end for a Q&A. So without further ado, I am going to hand over and stop sharing my screen so that James can share his.
Well, thank you. It's just taken me a moment to find my screen, so apologies for that. But thank you so much for being here today, and I'm very excited to talk to you and to talk to you about my new book, Understanding Buddhism, and some things to do with Buddhism as well. So my book's kind of an aside, though as nice as that is, but it's going to talk about some of the things that it tries to do, and also hopefully improve some of our understanding of Buddhism and how we approach it, and especially how we approach it within the classroom as well. As Una said, I think there's Q&A and different things, so I don't know if you can put questions in while I'm speaking, but I will come back to those at the end. If you do social media, most social media apart from TikTok, because I'm like 50, so why would I? I'm at James D. Holt on whichever social media you choose for old people. So if I begin just by talking about the series, so this is the second in a series of at least 6 books that we're going to be publishing. So the first one, Understanding Sikhism, was published in January, and Buddhism is the one that's published today. And then coming soon is Hinduism, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Hinduism is in with the publishers, so that's going through that process. So that will be out in about 6 to 8 months. And I'm currently writing Judaism. What I decided to do and what I noticed is I wrote a book called Ari in the Secondary School. And at the end of that book, there are 6 chapters that introduce the 6 bigger world religions. So the 6 that are mentioned here, but I could only really scratch the surface. And so what I wanted to do was to begin to share some of my understanding about the different religions that we find within the world. And it's 6 at the moment because those are the bigger 6, but there may be more that we add to the series as time goes on. But I began with ones that I thought teachers perhaps would appreciate support with. And so each book gives subject knowledge and also how we could approach that within the classroom. So essentially the book I would have loved when I started teaching nearly 30 years ago. So if I just show you the contents page for the Understanding Buddhism book, you will notice that it's split into 2. The first section is very much about the beliefs of the religion, whether that's Buddhism or Sikhism, but in this instance, it's the key concepts, the beliefs, and also, in essence, how those find expression within Buddhism and within Buddhism today. And that's really key, because sometimes when we teach religion, when we study religion, we kind of look at it as a historical exercise, where actually the most important part of religion for when we're teaching and when we're trying to understand is the lived reality of religion in people's lives. And that finds even greater expression in part 2, where we explore things like the ethical dimension and what Buddhism is like in Britain today. Because that's the other thing that sometimes I find is that we're very good at teaching religion as it happens, I don't know, abroad, whether that's how Hinduism happens in India or how Islam happens in a majority Muslim country. But actually, for most of the students and for most of the people that we teach, their experience of the individual religions is in this country. And so how is Islam, how is Buddhism, how is Christianity lived within Britain, and what does that mean? And has there been any things that are not lost in translation, but kind of been adapted to better fit life in Britain today, and what are the challenges that is faced therein? So one of the key themes that I talk about throughout the book is the representation of what is seen to be authentic Buddhism. And there is an attempt in history over the last 200 or 300 years, because the term Buddhism wasn't used until I think the early 19th century, possibly the late 18th century, but the early 19th century. Yes, there were people who followed the teachings of the Buddha and all of those things, but Buddhism as kind of a reified object, as a belief system, didn't really exist until it kind of had an encounter with colonialism and colonialists. So possibly the coolest looking theologian I've ever come across, Jonathan Smith, and you can see him on the screen, he says that religion is not a native category. It's not a first person term of self-categorization. It's a category imposed from the outside on some aspect of native culture. It is the other, in these instances colonialists, who are solely responsible for the content of the term. So what he suggests is that religions, and I'll extend this to Buddhism, they have been constructed, or they have been defined by colonialists, by Western colonialists. So there's been let me use an example. And so in the book, I talk about the Buddha. Now, most courses that we teach, or most classes that we teach on Buddhism, will begin with the life of the Buddha. And yes, the Buddha is important, but as is suggested here, Siddhartha Gautama is developed as a central focus of Buddhism in the West, and certainly the Buddhism that is taught in classrooms. Authors such as Tomoko Masuzawa highlight that original Buddhism was mined and reified in the 19th century with reference to texts in India, with little reference to the lived reality of different Buddhisms in other countries. And so what happened was Western colonialists, who understood religion through the lens of Christianity, essentially defined what Buddhism was, and almost told Buddhists what it was in the empire, by focusing around a person, because Christianity is made sense of through a book, but also through the life of Jesus. And so therefore, Buddhism was established in the person of Siddhartha Gautama, or Shakyamuni Buddha, or Buddha Gautama. So at the very end of this, it says, in a Buddhist worldview, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, is the latest in a line of Buddhas over the eons of time to have found the path to enlightenment and established a framework for others to follow. This does not negate his importance nor impact, but helps people realize that it's the truths that are of most importance as they seek for enlightenment. So this is the idea that really it is the truths that he taught. So we'll talk about the Four Noble Truths in a moment, but by them being noble, it means that the four truths that are accepted by noble ones, so the people who accept, rather than the truths themselves being noble, it's the people who accept them that are. So it slightly shifts the way that we understand religion and the way that we understand Buddhism, because yes, the Buddha is important, but he's not as important as perhaps we suggest, when all we do is we begin with the Buddha and then everything else is an outworking from him. He is someone who has rediscovered this path, if you like, or the path to enlightenment. And so when we think about how Buddhism is taught in the classroom, and this is a huge generalization, so I do apologize if this is not you. Basically, what is taught is Theravada Buddhism with the Wheel of Life from Mahayana chucked in. So we'll have Theravada Buddhism, the life of the Buddha, and possibly the Wheel of Life, which is from the Mahayana tradition. Why? So when I teach my students about Islam and kind of say, okay, well, what is it that we teach within the classroom, whether we're teaching primary or secondary, we teach Sunni Islam, maybe with some bits of Shia and other traditions, kind of as an addendum or as an additional thing. And we do that because, I'm making up figures, but about 80% of the world's Muslims are Sunni. So when we look at Theravada and we look at Mahayana as the two bigger traditions within Buddhism, you would imagine that that would be why we teach Theravada, because it's the most. Well, actually, it's not. It's it's about 60 to 70% Mahayana and 30-ish% Theravada. So why do we teach it? Well, again, this is part of the colonial hangover. I think there's maybe a possible other reason as well. So the colonial hangover is that Theravada is the first Buddhism that was encountered within India, because Buddhism is a religion that spread east, and so into China and Japan and Sri Lanka and other areas. But Theravada is the one that British colonialists first encountered. And also from Theravadan perspective, it is the idea that is the oldest, so therefore the most authentic. But it does kind of seem, and that's one of the issues that I have sometimes with the way that we teach, or the way that Buddhism is taught, is that it focuses on a particular approach and doesn't really recognize the complexity and the diversity that is within Buddhism. So John Strong wrote a book that's called Buddhisms, and the S is in a bracket, because really the many different traditions of Buddhism kind of just indicates that there is that huge diversity. So I will come back to this and what I mean by this, but it kind of misses. So Buddha Gautama, the Buddha that you will see on the left as you look at the screen, that is the traditional kind of view of who the Buddha is. But then our students will encounter others. So for example, Amida Buddha, who's at the bottom in the middle, and then other Bodhisattva, and we'll come back to that concept later. It misses, if all we teach is Theravada, it misses a huge diversity, but also a richness that you find throughout the Buddhist world. And it is really interesting to look at this. So one of the things that we teach, for example, is that the Buddha taught that there was no God. But then we look at a Pew Research report from a couple of years ago that found that 33% of Buddhists in India believe in God. And it's like, well, how do we account for this diversity? Now, I think there's a problem with the question that was asked, but essentially there's a whole range of approaches to Buddhism that we really need to recognize when we teach. But oftentimes we just teach kind of the monolithic view. And so I suggest that kind of the default is we look at the Four Noble Truths, and they're accepted by most Buddhists. So absolutely, we need to teach the Four Noble Truths. That's not in dispute. And the various outworkings of them and the different beliefs that kind of form part of that. And there's a whole chapter devoted, well, and 2 chapters devoted to the Four Noble Truths within it, the concepts of sunyata or emptiness as part of that. And what actually do we mean by suffering? Because one of the things that I think we need to recognize is that sometimes when we use words, whether they're from Pali or from Sanskrit, their transliteration or their translation doesn't mean as much as it should. So when we talk about dukkha, sometimes translated as suffering or unsatisfactoriness, there's a lot more behind it than just what we perhaps would include with regards to suffering. So I'm not saying that we don't teach the Four Noble Truths. We absolutely must. That's true. But as I say at the bottom here, it should be appended with an and, so that the range of interpretations based on interpretive lenses should be addressed. So this is the idea that for many Buddhists, many Theravadan Buddhists, the end goal of existence, if you like, is enlightenment, is nirvana. But for Mahayanan Buddhists, or many Mahayanan Buddhists, the ideal is to become a bodhisattva, which is to put off enlightenment, or to become a being that puts off enlightenment to help others attain enlightenment. And so it's a much more compassionate goal. And so if all we do is stop, for example, at nirvana, then it doesn't tell the whole story. So it's an and, it's not a but, it's a comma rather than a full stop. We're moving forwards with what we're teaching. We're recognizing that there's a greater diversity to what we teach. And part of this is to do, and oftentimes I use the Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon album, but I think it was the lead singer or lead guitarist last year came out with this album, or his tour poster, which suggests there's various different aspects to our culture and experience that refract the light or refract our understanding of the message that we receive. So Buddhism is a very good example of this. And so The Dalai Lama, he wrote a book and he talks about geographical understanding. So rather than Theravada and Mahayana, he's talking about geographical understandings, because when we look at Buddhism, for example, in Japan, it's different to Buddhism in China, which is different to Buddhism in India, and so on. And then within Britain itself, there are expressions of each of those, I'll use the word traditional understandings of Buddhism, but for example, in the 1960s, there was the growth of what was known as Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, and is now known as Triratna. So again, lots of things are understood. So when we see, for example, the statue of Buddha, who would be the fat laughing Buddha, that is an interpretation as Japanese Buddhism. And it utilizes, for example, deities or beings that were in that particular culture. So it's really important that we recognize the cultural impact Buddhism has, but also the host culture, if you like, has on Buddhism. And it's completely embraced and it's recognized and it's understanding. So the geographical understandings of Buddhism are really important as well. So then you have a book like this, by a man called David McMahon. And in it, in the first chapter, he talks about 4 people: a Western Buddhist sympathizer, a Thai laywoman, an American Dharma teacher, and a traditional monk. And if you read their biographies, they're probably only about a page long. They are so different, their understanding. So, for example, the Thai laywoman, very much there are statues or rupas, if you like, of different what would be considered deities, and there are amulets that she will wear, whereas the American Dharma teacher is much more, I guess, modern in her outlook towards Buddhism. So it's really important that we don't, and I would say this of all religions, but with regards to Buddhism, that we don't pigeonhole, that we need to think outside of the traditional understanding. So what does a Buddhist look like? What does a Buddhist do? Well, that's just really complicated. And one of the things that I used to use in a classroom was a part of an episode of The Simpsons where Lisa becomes a Buddhist. And there's all kinds of things wrong with its representation, but it's wrong from a textbook perspective. And that's the problem. Sometimes we teach textbook Buddhism, whereas this whole range of diversity that we find just by scratching the surface. And when you speak to Buddhists in Britain, we find the same diversity within expressions of Buddhism. So that's my first thing about kind of recognizing that there isn't really an authentic Buddhism. There is an authentic, well, there is an authentic Buddhism because it's just whatever a person lives, but there's not one kind of right answer, if you like. But the other issue that I find, or I talk about a lot, is the modernization of Buddhism. And so, as I mentioned, Buddhism began to be developed as a system, though it's 2,500 years old as a way of life from the time of the Buddha. But its reification or its systematization began in the 19th century. And one of the things that I think has been modernized, and when it's clashed with modern culture, things have developed. And is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? It depends on your view. But one of the things that has been modernized is the view of the Buddha. So if we look at the Pali Canon, which is generally accepted by Theravadan Buddhists, and some Mahayanans as well will accept these suttas, but perhaps with additional things. These are the narrations of the Buddha's life. And then we move on and we have another 5, which are within 200 to 300 years. And this is one of the things that we find with religious leaders, whether it's Jesus, whether it's Guru Nanak, whether it's the Buddha, and even to some extent with the Prophet Muhammad, is that there are very few, if any, contemporary accounts. It's all what people have written afterwards. And so these are 5 traditional tales of the Buddha's life. But again, they're 200 or 300 years later. So we have to look at, well, why were the people writing and what's it? And then if we fast forward to today, there are many books that tell the life of the Buddha. And one of the things that Peter Harvey, who's a great scholar of Buddhism, talks about is trying to dig back to the bare facts of the Buddha's life can be like stripping the patina off a fine antique, something many people would be wary of doing since it might be disrespectful to the original. However, perhaps it's necessary because the antique Buddha needs restoring, and doing so may reveal the various decorations that have been added over the centuries. We need to be aware that being too restricted by too narrow a view of what is possible leads us to a rather thin and shallow way of seeing. So these are two books, both of which I've read and are really good introductions to the life of the Buddha. So Tenzin Chogyal writes from a Tibetan Buddhist perspective, I think in the 19th century, possibly 18th. Whereas the one on the right, and I can't quite see the author's name, Blomfield, he writes, it's a modern book. And he's writing actually from a Triratna perspective as well. But we look at both of these and they're very different. So the core, the spine of the story of the Buddha's miraculous birth, his life of hedonism essentially, or of pleasure, and then his seeing of the four sights, and then his studies, and also his life as an ascetic, and then his path to enlightenment, and so on. The core is there, but the detail is different. And this is sometimes what I mean by the modernization of it. And so some people have written, and I think Blomfield kind of does this, is they write to a modern audience, and therefore some aspects of his story are missed. So the example that I use here is, I'll come back to that one in a minute, is when he's leaving the palace. So if we read Chogyal's story, 4 sons of the gods lifted Kantaka into the air, Indra opened the palace gate, and the 4 guardian kings and their troops protected the Bodhisattva. Brahma and the other gods prayed to him, and the Bodhisattva departed the palace. All of these gods are in Tushita heaven, and so they are worshipping the Buddha. Now, we understand, whether we look at the Theravada planes of existence or the Mahayana wheel of life, that we have different realms of existence, and the realm of the gods is one of them. They are not the be-all and end-all. Brahma may believe himself to be kind of the creator, but he's not, and he's not understood to be within Buddhism. But if I read, for example, Blomfield's example, these spiritual supernatural elements have been edited out because they don't quite fit the rational secular view of the Buddha's life. Now, who's right? Is it Chogyal or is it Blomfield? Again, these are things. So if we go back to the very earliest narrations of the Buddha's life, we have these miraculous elements. Does that mean they are true? Or does that mean that it was just the view of the believers, and so they were trying to articulate those, that obviously in terms of their Hindu neighbors, that the Buddha was far superior, if you like. So we have all of these different things that are there. And we have to be, I think we have to be very careful when we use the story of the Buddha's life, not just to make it almost explainable and straightforward. Because there are traditions throughout Buddhist history that are more, I'll use the word supernatural. I don't really know what I mean, I guess, but it's just looking at those things, because that also reflects, and I'll go back to the previous slide, and I'm very aware it's getting dark. Sorry, put my light on. There are 2 different views tend to be as to who the Buddha is. So within the Theravada tradition, and as I mentioned, Dalai Lama and Chodron term it's the Pali tradition, the Buddha has been a Buddha in waiting for a Bodhisattva for many, 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 many lifetimes. And the Jataka tales often tell stories of his previous lifetimes. But he's waiting, and then through his life, he becomes enlightened. Whereas in many forms of the Mahayana tradition, yes, he's lived many lives as a Bodhisattva, but he actually attained full awakening before his life. And so he actually lives his life almost as a charade to teach important truths. And that's really important, because when we look at the life of the Buddha, it is almost a parable or an allegory of the 4 noble truths, because he discovers the truth of suffering and the middle way. He's had hedonism, he's had asceticism, neither works, so he lives the middle way. So we have these different understandings, and I think as we move forward with our understanding of Buddhism, we need to, many, most, some is always my mantra, isn't it? That essentially we need to talk about, well, many Buddhists believe this, and it leaves open the possibility of exploring different approaches in the future. And again, we need to think for ourselves, who do we prioritize of all the different Buddhisms? What is the tradition that we are prioritizing? Also to do with the modernization, one of the things that we find within society, and especially within Buddhism, is, I'm going to call it the cultural appropriation. And there is a debate about whether it is cultural appropriation or not. And Liz Buchar talks about this a little bit. So there are elements of Buddhist practice that seem to have been adopted within society, but in some ways they have been stripped of the religion. And so Liz Buchar raises this issue with regards to meditation, though her focus is Hindu, but it can be around Buddhist as well. So she suggests that by engaging in the techniques, feeling their benefits, we were implicitly externalizing the religious ideas behind them as well. I wanted him, her meditation teacher, to acknowledge that we were in an ethical grey area when we offered these techniques to students without mentioning these religious connections. So we have things, and we'll talk about this in a moment, such as mindfulness, such as meditation, all of which are central to Buddhism and the seeking of enlightenment and becoming a bodhisattva, or whatever the goal is. And so mindfulness is really key. And sometimes, and this is one of the issues that we face when we teach about religions, is that even if they're not the same, the terminology is the same. And so sometimes when we talk about things to children, they will have heard of mindfulness because go to many primary schools and mindfulness is something that is done. So is that the same? And this is one of the questions that kind of we need to approach and think about. So at one end of the spectrum, we have Ronald Purser, and he has written a book, as you can see on the right hand side, called McMindfulness. And so this is the idea that mindfulness, meditation, and he uses the phrase, has been oversold and commodified. I don't know what I do know what I think. I go into my local home sense, for example, and I will see Buddha's heads on sale. And so is that appropriate? Now, I have no problem with people who are using Buddha Rupas as a focus for meditation. Absolutely, that is a religious tradition and a spiritual practice. Excuse me, I'm about to sleep. But is that, excuse me, is there use, I don't know, in our back gardens or on our mantelpieces? Is this a commodification? Is this a kind of a, I don't know, a cultural appropriation that is appropriate? Now, Ronald Purser would suggest, yes, it is, and we have, it's a problem. But the other issue is not to do with its commodification, but to do with its practice. And actually, the mindfulness that we practice in society, though it may have its roots in Buddhist spirituality, is not Buddhist mindfulness. So Donald Lopez, who's one of the foremost writers on Buddhism, suggests that it's about reducing or dealing with stress rather than following the Buddha, who sought to destroy complacency in order to lead us to a state of eternal stress reduction. So its purpose is very different. And so we have to see it as such. And so he would say, no, do you know what? It's not Buddhist at all. So don't stress about it. But in our children's mind, it is similar. And so we have to kind of deal with that, but at the same time recognize that their motivations are very different, what they're trying to achieve. So both mindfulness in a secular society works and can give people focus and help people deal with stress. But in a Buddhist context, it's about removing that stress, removing that suffering. And so we have to be careful about kind of overlapping the two, which sometimes we do. And I think even Buddhists do this as well. So it's the same thing. And so we have to, because we have a shared kind of lexicon of what we're talking about. Whereas if you look at, for example, someone like Thich Nat Han, who's one of the best writers on Buddhism, he talks about mindfulness, and he talks about, for example, mindfully peeling an orange, or mindfully washing the dishes. So that is being in the moment and being aware of what we are doing, and rather than kind of focusing on lots of different things and all kinds of things that kind of sell, but just focusing on that one moment and what's going on. So it does have its similarities to the mindfulness that we find in society, but its focus and its meaning and its purpose is very different altogether. And then the last section of the book, though this is narrated throughout, looks at Buddhism in Britain. And if you look at the census data, now this census data is the 2001 census data. It might be the 2011 census data, but it can't be because the data is 2003. Buddhism is very interesting because one of the things that hasn't been released for the 2021 census yet is the ethnicity data. So you have the religious data, which places Buddhism 5th or 6th largest religion within the UK. But previous censuses, and this will come out next year, is it shows the country of birth and ethnicity of different religions. So Buddhism, in contrast to, for example, Islam or Hinduism, has a much greater kind of mix of ethnicity. So, for example, over half of the people who identified as Buddhist in the census were white and were born in Britain. So they could be second generation, or they could be even further back. And this is partly because, as we looked at before, one of the things that has happened within Buddhism that perhaps hasn't happened in other traditions is in its encounter with colonialism, but also in its encounter with Western culture, what has happened is that to some extent Buddhism has developed in concert with the culture of Britain. And so you look, for example, at Triratna Buddhism, which was founded in the 1960s, and within certainly traditional Theravada Buddhism and many forms of Mahayana Buddhism, what you have is you have a Sangha, or you have a Buddhist community that is split into the ordained and into the lay. Whereas Triratna, where people have lives and or busy lives and family lives, then that has broken down. That barrier between the lay and the ordained has broken down. So you still have ordained, but they are people with families, they are people with jobs. And so it's been, and one of the principles that you may find for a Theravadan monk is not to touch money. Whereas if you go to your local Triratna center, there will be a shop and there will be a vegetarian cafe and different things. So that's a lot more, I'm trying to think of the word, pragmatic in British society. You also have many people in the public eye who have embraced forms of Buddhism. So I'll start from the right. So you look at Tom Baker, who is the Doctor Who that I remember from my childhood. I've forgotten that gentleman's name, but he's an actor from Lost. And then Benedict Cumberbatch, and I've forgotten that lady's name. I think she's called Emily something. She's an actress. And then you have Suella Braverman, who is a member of Triratna Buddhism. So it's interesting. And what you can do is you can look at the way that some people, and I think what's really important is looking at the lived reality of Buddhism for many people in Britain today and think, well, are these practices, these things that people are doing, is the way they live their lives what we would see to be traditionally Buddhist? And it's interesting because a few years ago I wrote a specification for A-level Buddhism, and it went to Ofqual, who approved qualifications, and it got sent back because one of their expert reviewers had said, I think I'd said there were different attitudes to war within Buddhism, or attitudes towards violence within Buddhism, and basically got told, no, there's not. Buddhists are pacifist. And it's like, actually, most Buddhists are, and if you look at the teachings, but then you look at the way people live their lives, it can be very different. And one of the key figures, and this is moving beyond Britain, when Aung San Suu Kyi, before when she was in house arrest and all the different things, and she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, she was seen to embody Buddhist principles almost at a bodhisattva-like status. But then since taking power, there have been different things that she's done that suggest that Buddhism may not be as, or perhaps Buddhism is open to interpretation of how to live because of cultural and political practices that we recognize within other religions as well. So each of these people are important because they're British Buddhists, but there's lots of individuals that we will come across as well. And so how does a Buddhist live their life? So it's throughout the book, I try and give voice to the voice of British Buddhists and how they live the religion within Britain as well. And so these are just 4 people who or 5 people even, who kind of highlight that, who are in the public eye. Throughout the book, we talk about, or one of the things that I'm very clear to do is to provide, well, what does this mean for the classroom? What are the thoughts for the classroom? So when we talk about the 4 noble truths, when we talk about the principle of sunyata, and when we talk about what does it mean to have no permanent self? What does that mean for the classroom? And sometimes it challenges the simple explanations that we've had. So when I used to teach Buddhism, I've been out of the classroom. I'm now in university for about the last 14 or 15 years. But I remember when I was teaching about Buddhist attitudes to rebirth, I said, well, there's no soul. And that's a very easy thing to teach. It's quite a complicated concept. But at the same time, actually, that's not quite true. Because what one of the marks of existence highlights is that there's no permanent soul. So our stream of consciousness, that is our karmic consciousness, that is passed from one lifetime to the next. So for example, the Dalai Lama is a bodhisattva. He's a rebirth of a previous bodhisattva. There is a consciousness that's carried, but what's key is that everything changes. And so we have to break out of the almost stereotypical views that we are teaching, that we've inherited, and kind of recognize, and this is a phrase I use a lot, we recognize the messiness that religions have, that Buddhism has, that there's lots of different ways to be Buddhist, there's lots of different ways to understand and the implications for that. So as I mentioned here, one of the key things, and I've kind of talked about this a lot over the last 40 minutes, the most important examples are those from our local area. The diversity of the Buddhist experience in the UK is significant and should find expression in our classrooms. Unfortunately, this has not always been the case, and I use my classroom as a case in point. Buddhism is a religion, and okay, there's a discussion about whether it's a religion because there's no belief in God, and Colin Bloom, who issued a report from the government earlier this year, defined religion as believing in some kind of supreme being. So there is a debate, but I think that was settled a long time ago. It's a way of life, it's a religion. It transforms the individual as they understand the nature of existence. Sometimes in our writing and teaching, we forget that everything in Buddhism has its root in this teaching. Nothing in the Buddhist worldview makes sense without an understanding of sunyata, the 4 noble truths, and the purpose of existence in Arahant. So we have to reflect the reality of Buddhism. And as I suggest, only then does the richness and diversity of Buddhism be understood by those that we teach. So thank you for listening to me for 40 minutes, my goodness. Those are my contact details. I'll leave them on for a couple of minutes, but are there any questions? I don't know if anything's come through on the chat, but I will stop sharing now as well.
Yeah, there's been lots of love for you in the chat. While people, you might want to, people are saying it's absolutely fascinating, really enjoyable to listen to. I'm going to give people a couple of seconds to ask, to put any questions they might have in the chat. And while they do it, I'm going to put on the board the next sessions that we've got running. Over the course of this year, we're going to be giving out lots of free sessions to our partnership schools. and you can find out information about those on this link here. So there's two elements to this. If you're tax savvy, all you have to do is use your camera on your phone right now. And if you're interested in our postgraduate courses, you can scan the black outlined QR code. If you're interested in more talks, workshops and seminars, the red QR code is the one you need to scan. And next up with these, over the next few weeks, there's a whole host of introductory sessions being delivered by our childhood and our colleagues across the faculty, from experts in cognitive science, one of which is the Cognitive Science and Beyond, and how young children and young people learn. So if you're interested in any of those, please do sign up for them, and they are free for everyone. So that should give people a little bit of time in case anybody's asked any questions.
I did see one asking me for the slides, so the recording will be available, but if you send me an email or contact me on Twitter, then I will send you the slides, not a problem at all.
I just really enjoyed listening to that. It's a religion that you're right, that you kind of have this view of in your head, like so many, but then the same could be said for lots of faiths, isn't there? There's that whole idea of what you have in your head and what is the reality and how it's lived and experienced. Ruth's asked, is your book suitable for Key Stage 5 / A-level students?
Yeah, I would say yes. I mean, I can't even speak English. Its intended audience is for teachers or for beginning teachers. Mm-hmm. But I try and write, and this is one of the criticisms of my writing, I try and write to be understood, so that people can understand what I'm saying. So I think it would be accessible for Key Stage 5. It may not cover everything that you find in the A-level syllabus. I think it covers most things, but I think it would be useful for them to dip in and out of, and hopefully that would provide that information.
Then we've got a question from Tim, and he says, do you think the idea of worldview works for teaching Buddhism? And if there is anything comparable to the concept of worldview within Buddhism?
So a worldview, so for those of you not immersed in the RE world, there is a movement, there is an approach to teaching RE that is moving from the world religions approach to a religions and worldviews approach, which is kind of identifies non-religious, but essentially it does kind of what I said, and it recognizes that there's so many different influences in a person's life. So I have a particular religion, but it is not and it is influenced by the fact that I'm a man, that I'm English, and all of those, and that I'm a convert to that religion. So all of those different pressures, if you like, contribute to me making up that worldview. And I think that's exactly the same in Buddhism, is that Buddhism that is practiced by anybody is essentially a formalized worldview. And I think when we look, for example, at Nichiren Buddhism, which is particularly practiced in Japan, you can see a great the influence of Japan on its articulation and its formulation. And so I think that has become a worldview in and of itself. And so yes, there's in some ways that's, I think world religions has had a bad press recently within the RE world, but actually there's a lot that, if you've been teaching good RE for the last however many years, there's a lot that just recognizes the messiness and the individual nature of a religion, the core of essential doctrines, I guess, or beliefs or practices or whatever we want to do.
Oh, really interesting. And I wish we could delve deeper into that. But Debs has got a question. What should I say to my own young children that come home talking about mindfulness and doing yoga online?
So, and this is part of the mindfulness. So one of the issues, I think, is that, so you will have some religious people who say that their children cannot do it because it is religious practice, that it's Hindu, that it's Buddhist, so therefore they should not do that because we are not Hindu or Buddhist. And I think as we look at it, it might have its roots within Hinduism and Buddhism, but it's not anymore. It's not trying to do the same thing, or the secular practices are not trying to do the same thing. So I think if we are worried about it, and I don't know if we are, I think what Ruth says is that some people use mindfulness, or most people even use mindfulness for non-religious purposes, and others use it for religious purposes. In this instance, it is not for religious purposes. We're not trying to have the child attain nirvana or become enlightened or whatever else it might be. It is to deal with the stress. And so this is not religious mindfulness, this is secular mindfulness. And yes, as Ruth says, we never force a child to participate in an activity that they don't feel doing. So
key to that, isn't it? It's like nobody wants anybody doing something that they're being made to do, even, you know, regardless of your thoughts on that one. They've got some time for maybe one or two more questions. I love that they do it because it's calming and they enjoy it. I agree, you know, it is lovely. Said child didn't do it. Yeah. Lots of different responses to that. It's interesting, isn't it? I suppose it's being a bit mindful in how we introduce things like this, and the conversations that we have around it with our communities.
So I do sometimes something called a guided imagination, where people go on a journey in their mind to a particular place, a nice place, and there's never been any issue. But then I had a colleague who did it and called it a guided meditation. So it appeared overtly religious, and so we got a complaint from a parent: you're doing Buddhist meditation with my child? No, we're not. It was just the phraseology that was used to introduce it that kind of the problem kind of arose.
Oh, right. Okay, so it's all about the language that we use. Debs has asked, can we do a guided meditation next? I think we'll book it for the new year. Maybe it'll be an in-person one. I'm conscious of time and it being a Thursday evening and very late, so I'm just going to put those slides up that we had before, just again, just to remind people, if they want to take a picture or scan it, they are both on our website, but here we go. So just two things. The one on the left is for information about our postgraduate courses. We have a huge suite of weekend school master's level courses and other provision if you're interested in developing your own practice. And then the one on the right is more information about talks, workshops and seminars that are coming up over the next month, one of which is a series beginning in November, and that is about cognitive science. We're also doing introductory sessions on a variety of topics that will lend themselves to people's practice from early years right through to SEND and wider professional responsibilities. So again, thank you very much for your time. I'm going to stop the recording. And thank you very much, James, for your time.
No, thank you, and thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Una.
Is there any other activities as part of Interfaith Week that people might want to hear?